The sound of silence in the Black Ridge Valley wasn't peaceful. It didn't feel like the quiet grace of untouched wilderness or the serene stillness of an autumn twilight. It felt aggressive. It felt like something heavy pressed against your eardrums, forcing the air out of your lungs before you even had the chance to draw a breath. My name is Julian Vance. For 12 years, I worked as a senior audio forensic specialist and acoustic recovery engineer for the Federal Communications Commission. My entire life revolved around sound, isolating phantom frequencies from distorted cockpit recordings, cleaning up dying radio transmissions from lost sea vessels, and mapping acoustic footprints through dense geographical terrain. I spent my career proving that every sound leaves a ghost, a physical wave of energy that never truly dies, but simply decays into the background noise of the universe. I believed in physics. I believed in decibels, frequencies, and structural resonance. I didn't believe in haunted hills or mountain curses. That was before November 2024, when Stellar 6 went dark. Stellar 6 was an experimental deep-frequency monitoring relay tucked deep inside Valley Zero, a jagged, unmapped notch in the Appalachian chain, running along the border of West Virginia. The terrain was so steep and densely packed with magnetic ironstone that satellite imagery struggled to render a clear grid. The federal government had leased the land silently decades ago, erecting a lone 200-foot radio tower to capture low-frequency signals bouncing off the ionosphere. 3 days ago, the station's automated telemetry pinged once at 3:14 a.m., transmitted a bizarre 3-second acoustic spike that blew out 3 regional receivers, and then collapsed into total radio silence. 2 field technicians sent to investigate never checked back in. Their transport vehicle was located by aerial drone at the edge of the access road, its doors left wide open, the engine still idling until the fuel tank ran dry. I was brought in to salvage the station's hard drives and figure out what destroyed the signal relay. Joining me was Marcus Vance. No relation, though we joked about it. A veteran field comms engineer who had spent 20 years running fiber cables through the harshest tundra and mountain passes in North America. Driving our rugged, modified Chevrolet Suburban was Dr. Elena Rostova, a structural acoustic geologist from Johns Hopkins, whose life work focused on how seismic shockwaves interact with underground cavern networks. We pulled up to the trailhead just as the sun was beginning its steep descent behind the razor-sharp crest of Black Ridge. The autumn air was cold enough to turn our breath into thin, drifting clouds of white mist. As soon as Elena killed the Suburban's V8 engine, the silence hit us like a physical wall. "God," Marcus muttered, stepping out onto the frost-dusted gravel. He reached up, rubbing the back of his neck and wincing. My ears popped the second we crossed that dry creek bed. "What's the barometric pressure down here?" Elena checked her handheld telemetry unit, her eyebrows knitting together in confusion. "Pressure is stable, but look at the ambient decibel reader." She held up the screen toward us. The digital display read minus 12.4 dB. "That's impossible," I said, slinging my heavy Pelican case containing the multi-channel recorder over my shoulder. An anechoic chamber, the quietest room on Earth built by humans, hits around -9 decibels. And in those rooms, human beings start hallucinating after 45 minutes because they can hear their own blood rushing through their eyeballs. You can't have -12 decibels in an open mountain valley. The wind alone should give us 30. "Well, tell that to the forest," Elena replied quietly, looking out into the dense wall of pine and bare birch trees. There were no birds, no squirrels chattering in the canopy, no rustling of dry leaves under the paws of small predators. Even the wind, which we could visibly see swaying the highest branches of the ancient hemlocks above us, made absolutely no sound. The leaves moved in violent, rhythmic motions, yet not a single rustle reached our ears. It was like watching a film on mute. "All right," Marcus sighed, pulling out 3 heavy-duty tactical 2-way radios from his crate and handing them out. "Let's stick to standard protocol." We hiked 2 miles up the service trail, reached the relay station, pull the driver A, and get the hell out of here before total dark. "Keep your headsets on channel 4. And Julian, test your rig." I unclipped the directional shotgun microphone from my harness, pulled on my studio-grade isolation headphones, and flipped the power switch on the 6-channel recorder. The moment the current surged into my headphones, a spike of cold panic shot straight down my spine. I didn't hear static. I didn't hear white noise. Through the high-sensitivity microphones, I heard a sound that didn't belong in any forest. It was a faint, wet, rhythmic scraping sound, like a heavy iron blade being dragged slowly across wet river stones. But it wasn't coming from the left or the right, or somewhere deeper down the trail. The microphone picked it up equally from every single direction, at once. It was coming from the air itself. "Julian?" Elena asked, noticing the color draining from my face. "What do you have?" I took off my headphones, my hand shaking slightly as I checked the gain knobs. "Nothing," I lied, forcing a tight breath out. "Just ground loop interference from the iron or in the soil. Let me recalibrate." We turned away from the vehicle and took our first steps onto the overgrown dirt path leading into Valley Zero. With every footstep we took, the crunch of dead leaves beneath our boots felt unnaturally loud, booming inside our own heads as if our skulls were hollowed-out speaker boxes. We didn't know it then, but we had already crossed the threshold. Valley Zero wasn't an empty piece of land. It was a chamber, and it had been waiting for new voices to fill it. The further we walked down the access trail, the more the forest seemed to warp around us. The canopy above was so thick with hemlock and twisted white pine that the fading autumn daylight could barely pierce through. What little light managed to filter down took on a strange, bruised purple hue. But it wasn't just the light that felt wrong. It was the physics of our own movement. Every time my boot hit the frozen soil, the sound didn't travel outward like it normally would. Instead, the crunch of dry leaves felt delayed, as if the audio of my footsteps was lagging half a second behind my actual physical motion. I would take a step, plant my heel, and only after my knee bent take the next stride would the sound of the first step hit my ears. "Do you guys feel that?" Marcus stopped abruptly, turning back to face Elena and me. He was breathing heavily, his hand resting on the grip of his sidearm. "It feels like walking underwater. Like the air is thick." Elena held up her acoustic sensor again. "It's not humidity, but the ambient density of the air is fluctuating wildly. The air pressure around our boots is higher than the air pressure at our shoulders. It's creating localized pockets of sonic resistance." "In English, Elena?" Marcus grunted, wiping a bead of cold sweat from his temple. "It means sound waves aren't traveling in straight lines." I answer for her, adjusting the straps of my recorder. "They're getting trapped, curving, bouncing off invisible thermal boundaries in the air before they ever reach a tree trunk or a rock face." We pushed forward for another 20 minutes until the dense tree line finally broke, revealing the Stellar 6 monitoring relay. The facility was smaller than I had imagined. It consisted of a single windowless cinderblock bunker painted in dull olive drab, surrounded by a sagging chain-link fence topped with rusted razor wire. Rising from the center of the bunker was the main telemetry tower, a 200-foot lattice of steel tubing bristling with parabolic dishes, whip antennas, and low-frequency induction loops. The heavy steel gate of the perimeter fence was standing wide open, swinging gently on its hinges, but it moved in total silence. No squeal of dry iron, no clatter against the fence post. "Look at the dishes," Elena whispered, pointing up toward the top of the tower. I looked up and felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. The massive aluminum parabolic dishes, designed to withstand hurricane-force winds, were twisted, not broken, not crushed by fallen trees, but spun on their mounts like soft wax melted in the sun. The metal feed horns at the center of the dishes were melted into spiral patterns, as if a colossal, invisible vortex of violent vibration had seized the steel and wrung it out like a wet rag. "That takes hundreds of thousands of watts of directional acoustic energy," Elena said, her voice barely above a tremor, or a blast wave from a high-yield explosive. "But the bunker is completely intact. Where are the techs?" Marcus muttered, unholstering his Glock 19 and holding it at low ready. "Miller, Chun, FCC field team, Identify yourselves. His voice boomed through the clearing. It was loud, authoritative, the trained bark of a former military contractor. His voice hit the concrete walls of the bunker. It traveled across the clearing, and then it died. There was no natural echo off the mountain ridge behind the facility. The sound of Marcus's voice just dropped into the dirt and disappeared. Nothing, Marcus said, taking a step toward the bunker's open reinforced door. Structure looks clear. Let's get inside, secure the drive arrays, and get the hell out of here before total dark. Marcus froze mid-step. His boot hovered an inch above the gravel. The voice hadn't come from inside the bunker. It hadn't come from behind us. It had come from the empty air right between Marcus and me. Clear, crisp, and perfectly articulated. It was Marcus's voice. It was the exact phrase he had spoken to us 15 minutes ago at the trailhead, down to the subtle rasp in his throat and the exact cadence of his breath. Who said that? Marcus whirled around, raising his weapon, his barrel sweeping the empty perimeter fence. Whose playback is that? Julian, is that your recorder? My recorder is on input monitoring only. I yelled, holding my hands up away from the control surface. I'm not playing anything back. Look at the meters. The digital needles on my 6-channel unit were slamming red, pinning against the far right margin of the display. But the frequency spectrum wasn't showing a normal voice pattern. It was showing a razor-sharp spike at 18.7 hertz. Deep infrasound, right at the threshold where human ears stop hearing sound and human organs start physically vibrating. Listen, Elena whispered, her face turning pale as paper. Listen to the ridge. We stood dead still in the middle of the yard. From deep within the dark forest behind the bunker, a faint, rhythmic sound began to build. It started as a low hum, like a distant diesel engine idling in a valley floor. But as it approached us through the trees, it separated into distinct layers. It was an echo, but it wasn't repeating what we had just said. It was repeating what we were going to say. Through the silent trees, creeping towards us across the dead leaves like an invisible wave of freezing water, came the sound of footsteps running in panic. Heavy, frantic footfalls pounding against the earth. And amidst the sound of those running feet came a blood-curdling, desperate scream, a woman's voice, raw with absolute, paralyzing terror, screeching a single sentence over and over into the dark. It's in my mouth. God, please, it's inside my chest. Elena gasped, clapping both hands over her mouth. Her eyes were wide, filled with tears of instinctual horror, because the voice screaming from the dark trees was her own. The sound of Elena's future scream lingered in the air, not fading out naturally like a normal echo, but snapping off abruptly as if an invisible knife had sliced through the audio wave mid-breath. Silence reclaimed the clearing around the stellar. 6 bunker, a silence so thick and heavy that the pounding of my own heart against my ribs sounded like a war drum echoing inside a closed wooden box. Elena was trembling violently, her hands still clamped tight over her mouth, her eyes fixed on the dark wall of hemlocks where her own terrified voice had just bled out into the night. That wasn't me, she choked out, her voice barely a breath. I didn't say that. I didn't say those words. It was a playback, Marcus said, though his voice lacked conviction. His hands were shaking on the grip of his pistol, the weapon trembling as he pointed it at the tree lean. Someone has a high-output speaker set up out there. They recorded us at the trailhead or pulled a voice print. A voice print can't predict the future, Marcus. I snapped, dropping to one knee to adjust the gain stages on my recorder. She hasn't spoken those words yet. The valley isn't reflecting what was spoken. It's reflecting what will be spoken. I pulled the studio headphones back onto my ears. The raw signal coming through the shotgun mic was getting worse. The 18.7 hertz infrasound tone was no longer a flat line. It was pulsating. Thump, thump, thump. It matched the exact resting heart rate of a dull human, but magnified 10,000 times over, vibrating through the soles of our boots. Inside. Now, Marcus ordered, grabbing Elena by the shoulder of her parka and pulling her toward the bunker's open steel doorway. We're sitting ducks in this yard. We ducked inside the facility, Marcus slamming the heavy, reinforced blast door behind us. He threw the deadbolts. The heavy steel latches engaged with a loud, metallic clang that reverberated through the concrete bunker. Except the sound didn't die down. Inside the enclosed room, the sound of the door slamming didn't bounce off the walls and decay within 2 seconds. It stayed suspended in the air. The clang hung in the center of the room like an invisible, vibrating glass sphere. We could actually walk around it. When I stepped to the left of the doorway, the metallic ringing was louder in my right ear. When I stepped behind it, the pitch shifted, becoming muffled and low. "The air in here has high acoustic viscosity," Elena whispered, forcing herself to focus on the signs to keep her panic at bay. She pulled out her laser distance measure and pointed it at the far wall. The red that flickered and warped, stretching into an oval shape. The sound waves aren't dissipating. They're pooling, like drop dye in cold water. They're settling into physical space. The bunker was lit only by the pale, emergency LED strips running along the baseboards. Dust motes floated in the air, but as I swept my flashlight beam across the room, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the center of the room, near the primary server racks, the dust motes weren't floating randomly. They were arranged in perfectly symmetrical, concentric rings suspended in midair, like the rings of Saturn or the grooves on a vinyl record. Cladni figures, I murmured, stepping closer. Pattern resonances caused by continuous standing waves. "Julian, look at the operator's desk," Marcus called out, his flashlight beam cutting through the dimness. The main monitoring console was a mess. 3 LCD monitors were smashed, their glass screen spiderwebbed from central impact points. But sitting right in the middle of the desk was an old-fashioned reel-to-reel analog tape recorder, a heavy Swiss-made Nagra 4S. Its 2 magnetic spools were spinning wildly, whipping the brown tape into a tangled bird's nest frenzy across the desk. Pinned to the desk right beside the spinning tape recorder was a handwritten logbook, open to the last entry. The handwriting started neat and precise, but by the end of the page, the ink was jagged, tearing to the paper as if the writer's hand had been violently spasming while holding the pen. I leaned over and read the final entry aloud. 3 a.m. It's not an echo. It's a sonic displacement. The valley is a pressure vessel. Every scream, every whisper, every thought spoken aloud since the glaciers retreated is trapped in the geological strata of Valley Zero. It doesn't forget. Now the vessel is full. The air is solidifying. Miller spoke at 2:30. At 2:45, his voice entered his own lungs from the outside and blew out his chest cavity. If you hear yourself talking from the dark, do not answer. Do not breathe it in. Miller. Marcus breathed, stepping back from the desk. That was one of the texts sent in 3 days ago. Suddenly, the tangled pile of magnetic tape sitting on the desk began to vibrate, without the tape head touching it. Without any power running to the unit speakers, the loose, tangled ribbon of brown tape in front of us began to speak. It didn't play music or static. It emitted a wet, gargling gasp, followed by the dry, rasping voice of an old man. I hear them coming down the mountain. 3 of them, Vance, Rostova, and the big one with the gun. They're standing in the bunker right now, reading my notebook. Elena backed away until her spine hit the concrete wall. That log was written 3 days ago, she whimpered. How did he know our names? How did he know we'd be standing right here? He didn't know, I said, looking up at the ceiling as a fine dust began to rain down on us from the vibration above. The sound of us being here, the sound of our feet on this floor, the sound of our voices reading his words, it traveled backward through time along the low-frequency standing wave. I looked at Marcus and Elena, the terrifying reality of Valley Zero finally crystallizing in my mind. We aren't just hunting a lost signal, I told them, my voice shaking. We are walking through an ocean of acoustic fossils. Every sound that will ever happen in this valley has already been recorded by the air itself, and it's playing our deaths back to us. piece by piece. The voice emanating from the loose spool of magnetic tape didn't fade out. It dissolved into a dry, hollow rattle, like dry corn kernels spinning in a tin can. Then, the tape snapped, the severed brown ribbon fluttering to the concrete floor like a dying snake. "We need to get the hard drives and fall back to the Suburban," Marcus barked, his voice tight, his former composure fracturing under the weight of what we were witnessing. He drew a heavy combat knife from his tactical vest and jammed it into the dry bay latch on the main server rack. Julian grabbed the telemetry logs. "Elena, stay behind me." "It won't matter if we leave," Elena said. Her tone wasn't frantic anymore. It was worse. It was flat, clinical, the terrifying calm of scientists whose internal model reality had just completely shattered. She walked over to the center of the bunker where concentric rings of dust hung suspended in midair. She reached out her gloved hand toward the innermost ring, a circle of floating debris no larger than a dinner plate. "Elena, don't touch that," I yelled. Her index finger brushed the edge of the floating dust ring. The moment her glove made contact with a standing wave pattern, a sound like a high-voltage arching cable erupted inside the room. It wasn't loud in decibels, but possessed an impossible physical density. Elena's hand was instantly yanked upward, her arm snapping straight, like a marionette pulled by a wire. She screamed, a short, sharp gasp of surprise, and as she did, the air 3 feet to her left rippled, a visible wave of distorted air, like the shimmering heat rising off black asphalt in July, absorbed the sound of her cry. The floating dust ring suddenly expanded outward, hitting the 4 concrete walls simultaneously. The entire bunker groaned. Hairline fractures spider-webbed across the poured concrete walls, spitting lime dust and tiny pebbles onto our heads. "It's acoustic lens," Elena gasped, clutching her wrist as the pressure released her arm. Her fingers were trembling, ice cold to the touch. The geography of Valley Zero, it's shaped like a giant parabolic reflector. The ironstone cliffs, the underground river caverns beneath the soil, the steep angle of Black Ridge, they form a closed acoustic cavity. "Explain it so I can shoot, Elena," Marcus shouted, wrenching the primary solid-state drive array free from the server rack with a loud screech of tearing metal. "You can't shoot a geometric shape, Marcus," I said, stepping between him and the door, holding my directional mic up toward the ceiling. "Think about how a magnifying glass works with sunlight. If you hold a lens at the exact focal length, it concentrates harmless daylight into a beam hot enough to burn through steel." I pointed toward the open valley outside the sealed steel door. Valley Zero is a physical lens for sound waves, but instead of focusing light, it focuses acoustic kinetic energy. For centuries, every noise made in this valley, thunderstorms, landslides, animal cries, human voices, has been bouncing back and forth between these ironstone walls. But the waves didn't escape into the atmosphere. The shape of the mountains pushed them inward, downward, into the very air we're breathing right now. "And the air is saturated," Elena added, her eyes wide as she looked at the walls continuing to microfracture around us, like water holding as much dissolved salt as physically possible. Add one more grain of salt, and the whole solution instantly crystallizes into solid ice. Add one more decibel of sound to this valley, and the air turns solid. I finish your sentence. It locks up. The sound waves become a physical structure. Marcus stared at us, the heavy drive array clutched against his chest. "So what happened to Miller and Chun?" "The techs." I looked down at the floor near the back of the bunker. I hadn't noticed it before because of the dim lighting, but now, sweeping my high-powered flashlight across the floorboards, the horrifying truth revealed itself. Near the back wall sat a pair of heavy work boots and a yellow high-visibility field jacket. The clothes weren't empty, but they weren't filled with bones or flesh either. Sitting inside the collar of the jacket was a solid, translucent mass of gray, crystalline dust, a perfect, millimeter-precise cast of a human head and shoulders, captured in the middle of an open-mouthed scream. It looked like a statue carved out of compressed volcanic ash and hardened ice. I knelt beside it and brought the shotgun microphone within 2 inches of the statue's open stone mouth. Through my isolation headphones, I heard it, deep inside the crystallized gray dust of the tech's frozen throat. A tiny, infinite loop of sound was vibrating, a voice trapped in a physical lattice of air, repeating a single syllable forever. "Help! It didn't get eaten," I whispered, my stomach turning violently as I backed away from a uniform. They didn't get shot. They spoke too loudly when the valley reached critical saturation. The sound wave froze inside their vocal tracts, and the air inside their lungs turned to glass. Before Marcus or Elena could respond, a deep, sickening vibration shook the bunker from beneath our feet. It wasn't an earthquake. It was the sound of the main door, the heavy steel blast door Marcus had thrown the deadbolts on 5 minutes ago. From the outside of the locked door, something began to knock. It wasn't a hand. It wasn't a battering ram. It was 3 distinct, perfectly rhythmized impacts of pure, focused acoustic energy, hitting the steel plate with the force of a wrecking ball. Thump, 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 and then, drifting right through the solid steel door as if the metal were nothing more than a mosquito net, came a voice we all recognized. It was my voice, Julian Vance's voice, coming from the dark outside, speaking with a terrifying, rhythmic precision. "Open the door, Julian. You need to let us out. We're suffocating in your lung." The sound of my own voice coming from the far side of that sealed blast door didn't feel like a trick. It felt like a physical intrusion. The tone was unnaturally flat, stripped of human breath or dynamic inflection, as if a machine had cut my vocal cords into individual audio slices and glued them back together out of sequence. "Open the door, Julian. You need to let us out. We're suffocating in your lungs." Marcus acted on pure survival instinct. He raised his Glock, stepped forward, and fired 2 rounds directly into the heavy steel lock mechanism. Bang, bang. In a normal room, 2 gunshots from a 9mm handgun would leave your ears ringing with a sharp, temporary threshold shift. But inside the hypersaturated air of the bunker, those 2 shots were a catastrophic mistake. The sound didn't disperse outward. The kinetic energy of the gunshot slammed into the standing waves floating in the center of the room, like a sledgehammer hitting a mirror. The air shattered. A blinding flash of pale blue, bioluminescent light erupted in the middle of the bunker. Not heat, but piezoluminescent light, caused by the violent compression of air molecules. A shock wave of pure sonic density struck us. The pressure wave knocked Marcus off his feet, sending him flying backward into the server racks with a sickening crunch. Elena was hurled against the operator's desk, her breath exploding from her chest in a strangled gasp. I hit the concrete floor hard, my studio headphones torn from my head. My ears weren't bleeding, but the sound didn't go away. It felt as though someone had poured molten lead into my ear canals. The air in the room was visibly warping now, swirling in thick, semi-transparent ribbons like syrup poured into cold water. "Marcus," I coughed, crawling across the vibrating floorboards toward him. The big engineer was groaning, clutching his left shoulder. The drive array he had wrenched from the server rack was lying 3 feet away, its metal casing dented, its cooling fan spinning in reverse from the atmospheric back pressure. Don't shoot," Elena choked out, struggling to sit up against the desk, her face pale, her lips tinged with a faint bluish hue. The air, every loud sound, it accelerates the crystallization. Above us, the steel door was no longer just vibrating. The center of the heavy blast door was bowing inward, the reinforced steel stretching toward us in a smooth, concave bowl, as if an invisible hydraulic ram were slowly pressing against it from the outside. And the voice outside wasn't alone anymore. Through the warped metal came the sound of a crowd, dozens of overlapping voices, all murmuring at once. Some were speaking in archaic 18th century English. Others were shouting military distress codes from the 1940s. Some were just sobbing. But running beneath that chaotic tapestry of dead voices was a single, unifying frequency, a rhythmic, wet-breathing sound that matched the pulsating 18.7 hertz infrasound tone. "The back exit," Marcus rasped, forcing himself to his feet, his right hand dragging his injured left arm up against his ribs. The service tunnel behind the power distribution units. I grabbed a hard drive array and slung my 6-channel recorder over my shoulder. Elena stumbled toward the rear of the bunker, where a heavy iron hatch led down into the concrete utility trench beneath the facility. Marcus threw the iron latch on the hatch. It gave way with a muffled, dull thud, the saturated air absorbing the high frequencies before they could resonate. "Go down, fast," he ordered. Elena dropped into the darkness of the ladder well first. I followed immediately behind her, my boots clattering against the rusted iron rungs. Marcus slipped through last, pulling the heavy iron hatch shut above us. We fell into a narrow, stone-walled tunnel that ran beneath the bunker, leading out toward the mountain slope behind the facility. The air down here smelled different. It didn't smell like damp earth or rust. It smelled like ozone and dry, burnt dust, the unmistakable odor of high-voltage electrical discharge. There were no lights. I clicked on my tactical flashlight, its narrow beam cutting through a dense, drifting haze that hovered 3 feet off the tunnel floor. It wasn't water vapor. It was gray, heavy acoustic dust, the physical residue of trapped sound, settling in the lowest points of the mountain like stagnant water. "Keep moving." Marcus grunted from the top of the ladder, his voice strained as he nursed his shoulder. The tunnel should pop out near the upper drainage canal, half a mile up the ridge. We hurried down the narrow passageway, our knees bent to avoid the low concrete ceiling. Then, Elena stopped dead in her tracks. "Elena, move!" I whispered frantically, bumping into her pack. "Julian," she said. Her voice wasn't scared anymore. It was hollow, devoid of hope. "Look at the floor." I lowered my flashlight beam to the tunnel floor in front of her boots. Lying in the middle of the concrete path, half submerged in the drifting gray acoustic dust, was a single object. It was a bright yellow, heavy-duty Pelican case, scratched, covered in mud, its latch broken open. Sitting right beside the case was a multi-channel audio recorder, its digital LED meters flickering wildly in the dark. I stared at it, my brain refusing to process what my eyes were seeing. It was my recorder, the exact same model, down to the custom yellow electrical tape wrapped around the battery compartment handle, and the serial number etched into the aluminum chassis, US FCC AD 091. I slowly reached down and touched my own hip. My recorder was still strapped to my side. I could feel the cold metal frame under my fingers. That's impossible," I muttered, my hands trembling as I knelt beside the broken unit on the floor. "I have my rig right here. This is a duplicate." "It's not a duplicate, Julian," Elena whispered, her voice cracking as tears finally overflowed her eyes, cutting clean tracks through the dust on her cheeks. "It's yours. It fell here 20 minutes from now." I reached out with a gloved hand and clicked the power switch on the broken recorder sitting in the dirt. The display didn't turn on. The screen was shattered, but the tiny internal speaker, powered by a dying capacitor, emitted a single clear audio playback. Through the static came the sound of running feet, heavy, frantic footfalls pounding against concrete, and then a woman's voice, raw with absolute, paralyzing terror, screamed the exact words we had heard outside the bunker 20 minutes ago. The gray acoustic fog didn't just drift, it coalesced. 20 feet ahead of us in the narrow concrete tunnel, the suspended particles of acoustic dust drawn off the floor began to vibrate in sync with that terrible 18.7 hertz infrasound pulse. It swirled into a towering, slender silhouette, its outline blurring and sharpening with every beat of my own erratic pulse. The shape didn't have eyes. It didn't have a face. But as my flashlight beam cut through its translucent center, I saw a horrifying lattice of standing sound waves mapped inside it, a glowing, geometric web of blue piezoluminescence that mimicked the structural shape of a human nervous system. Don't speak," I whispered, my voice barely a thread of air passing over my dry tongue. "Don't give it any more energy." Marcus, his right hand still clutching his broken shoulder, slowly reached down to his belt with his good hand. He didn't draw his gun this time. He drew a heavy, magnesium emergency flare. He struck the cap against the friction head. SHRRHHH. A blinding, violent crimson light erupted in the enclosed space, showering the concrete walls with white-hot sparks. In a normal atmosphere, the sudden ignition of a magnesium flare creates a sharp, rushing hiss of displacing oxygen. But here, inside the hyperdense air of the utility tunnel, the sound of the flare ignition didn't travel down the hallway. The sound wave was instantly seized by the thick air and compressed. The crimson flame didn't flicker outward. Instead, the sound of the ignition formed an invisible physical sphere of acoustic pressure around the tip of the flare, a ball of compressed air so dense that it physically pushed the rising gray fog backward. The sound wave had become a shield. "Run!" Marcus roared, his voice muffled as if he were shouting through a thick mattress. "Toward the emergency exit ladder. Move!" We scrambled past the broken recorder on the floor, our boots kicking to the piles of gray acoustic dust. The silhouette of acoustic fog didn't chase us like a living creature. It displaced toward us. Every time our boots hit the ground, the kinetic energy of our footfalls pulled the shape closer, as if our sound were magnetic poles drawing the entity straight into our wakes. The air was getting noticeably heavier with every yard we gained. Breathing felt like inhaling lukewarm soup. My lungs had to work twice as hard to expand my chest cavity, pulling against an atmospheric drag that felt unnatural, almost sticky. The air wasn't hot, but my throat burned with dry, metallic sensation, the taste of iron and ozone. "There!" Elena gasped, pointing her flashlight up ahead. At the end of the tunnel sat an ancient, circular iron ladder, leading straight up into a vertical drainage shaft. At the top of the shaft, 30 feet above us, a faint beam of bruised, twilight sky was visible through a rusted iron grate. Elena reached the ladder first. She grabbed the iron rungs and began to climb, her movement slow, heavy, as if she were lifting lead weights tied to her ankles. I stood at the base of the ladder, holding my flashlight up to illuminate her path, my shotgun mic pointing back down the dark tunnel toward the approaching crimson glow of Marcus's flare. Through my isolation headphones, the sound coming from the tunnel wasn't just noise anymore. It was a choir of whispers. Thousands of soft, overlapping voices, murmurings, and sighs were pouring out of the concrete walls. They weren't speaking to us. They were speaking through each other. I heard voices reciting 19th century church hymns. I heard logging crew foremen shouting orders from 60 years ago. I heard the frantic radio chatter of lost military pilots whose planes had clipped Black Ridge in the winter of 1952. The valley's memory wasn't fading. It was layering. Every sound ever spoken in Valley Zero was pressing against the tunnel walls, seeking a way out, seeking a fresh pair of human lungs to act as a resonator, to carry them back into the world of the living. "Julian," a whisper detached itself from the wall, right beside my left ear. It wasn't coming through my headphones. It was vibrating directly against the mastoid bone behind my earlobe. "Julian, your mother's voice. Remember the song she sang before the hospital room went quiet?" My blood ran ice cold. My knees buckled. "Julian!" grabbed the rungs. Marcus shoved me hard from behind, breaking the acoustic lock that had pinned my mind to the wall. He forced my hands onto the rusted iron rungs of the ladder. "Don't listen to it," Marcus yelled, his face inches from mine, his eyes bloodshot, his skin pale and slick with cold sweat. "It uses your own memory against you. It pulls the acoustic signatures out of your brain." I began to climb, pulling my heavy frame up the ladder rung by rung. Above me, Elena reached the top of the shaft. She placed both hands against the rusted iron grate covering the exit and pushed with all her strength. Creak! The iron grate moved an inch, caked mud and dead pine needles raining down onto her face. She opened her mouth to draw a deep breath to push again. "Elena!" "No, don't inhale deeply." I screamed from 10 feet below her. It was too late. As Elena gasped for air, the thick, gray acoustic dust floating up the vertical shaft was pulled violently into her mouth. She didn't choke. She didn't cough. The moment the gray dust crossed her lips, her entire body went rigid. Her eyes rolled back until only the whites were visible in the moonlight filtering through the grate. Her jaw locked wide open, stretching so far that the skin at the corners of her mouth tore, thin trickles of dark blood running down her chin. And from deep within her chest, from inside her lungs, a sound began to resonate. It wasn't a human scream. It was a terrifying, rhythmic 18.7 hertz infrasound pulse. Her rib cage began to vibrate so violently beneath her parka that I could hear her sternum rattling against her spine. She looked down at me through the rusted grate, her open mouth emitting a dense, gray cloud of exhaled acoustic fog, and rasped the words we had been running from all night. It's in my mouth. God, please, it's inside my chest. The sound emerging from Elena's chest wasn't just coming out of her throat. It was expanding outward, displacing the physical space inside the narrow vertical shaft. Her sternum vibrated with such violent intensity that tiny flecks of blood began to spray from her lips, catching the moonlight in pale, glistening droplets. The gray acoustic fog pouring from her mouth didn't rise toward the open sky above. It sank downward, pulling around her shoulders like heavy grease, cascading down the rungs of the iron ladder straight toward me. "Elena!" I yelled, reaching up with my free hand, my boots slipping on the slick, rusted iron. I grabbed her left ankle, trying to drag her down away from the grate, but her leg felt like it was cast in solid concrete. Her muscles were completely rigid, locked in a state of acoustic tetany. The vibration running through her body traveled straight down the metal ladder into my arm. The moment the vibration hit my fingers, my hand went numb. My fingers unclasped involuntarily, the sensation of 1,000 needles driving into my nerve endings forcing me to drop back a rung. "Julian, get down!" Marcus's voice bellowed from the bottom of the shaft. He didn't wait for me to comply. Reaching up, he grabbed the back of my tactical harness with his good hand and yanked me off the ladder. We both tumbled backward onto the concrete floor of the utility tunnel, landing in a chaotic heap of limbs, cables, and loose gear. Above us, the air inside the vertical shaft began to change. The gray acoustic dust hanging around Elena stopped swirling. It didn't disperse into the night air through the open iron grate. Instead, under the continuous pressure of that 18.7 hertz pulse, the dust molecules drew together, interlocking at a molecular level. Before our eyes, the translucent air inside the top 10 feet of the shaft crystallized. It didn't turn into ice. It turned into a solid, opaque block of gray, glassy material, a plug of compressed sound that completely encased Elena from her waist to her head. She was suspended mid-climb, frozen inside the solid air like an insect trapped in ancient amber. Her eyes remained open, staring blankly down at us through the translucent, gray mass. Her open mouth was reserved in an eternal, silent gasp, the cloud of fog coming from her lips frozen into a web of delicate, mineralized tendrils. Jesus Christ. Marcus breathed, scrambling backward on his elbows, his eyes wide with unadulterated horror. She's trapped in it. It locked her in. She's not dead. I rasped, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought my chest would crack. I scrambled to my feet and pointed the shotgun microphone up toward the frozen block at the top of the shaft. Through my headphones, I didn't hear silence. Through the solid gray plug of air, I could hear Elena's heart. Thump, thump, thump. It was beating at a fraction of its normal speed, once every 10 seconds. The acoustic crystallization had suspended her biological functions, locking her cells in place, preserving her consciousness while trapping her inside a vault of her own echoed voice. "We can't break it," I said, my hand shaking uncontrollably as I looked at the solid plug of air blocking our only exit to the surface. "If we hit that block with something heavy, the impact wave will travel straight to the crystal and shatter her body into dust. Then we go back," Marcus said, his voice breaking as he looked away from Elena's frozen face. "Back through the bunker. We take the main access road." "We can't go back, Marcus." I grabbed his tactical vest, pulling him around to face me. "Look at the tunnel behind us." Marcus turned his head, and his breath hitched in his throat. The horizontal utility tunnel we had just run through was no longer open. The gray acoustic dust that had been drifting along the floor had risen to the ceiling. The air behind us had solidified into a smooth, seamless wall of gray, glassy stone. Step by step, minute by minute, the valley was filling in its own empty spaces. It was turning its open corridors into solid, acoustic rock, sealing us inside its throat. We were trapped in a 10-foot section of concrete tunnel between two solid walls of crystallized air. The air in here, Marcus whispered, touching his own throat, his eyes darting around the small space. It's getting colder. He was right. The temperature was plunging rapidly. With every sound wave that locked up and turned solid, kinetic energy was being drained from the atmosphere. The moisture on the concrete walls was freezing into sharp, needle-like frost. Our breath was no longer forming soft clouds. It was coming out as tiny, glittering ice crystals that fell straight to the floor with faint, metallic clinks. "Julian," Marcus said, stepping close to me, his voice barely a murmur. "My radio, it's doing something." I looked down at the tactical two-way radio clipped to his shoulder harness. The power knob was switched to off. The battery pack had been removed 20 minutes ago inside the bunker. Yet, the small green receiving LED on top of the radio was glowing with a brilliant, blinding intensity. From a silent speaker came no static, no white noise. It was the sound of a heavy iron door opening somewhere deep underground. A low, grinding sound of stone scraping against stone, accompanied by the rhythmic, wet footfalls of a single person walking toward us through the dark. And then, the radio speaker emitted a voice that wasn't an echo of us, and wasn't an echo of the lost text. It was an old, raspy, authoritative voice. A voice that sounded like it belonged to a man who had been buried underground for 100 years. Asterisk, "You're standing on the roof of the vault, boys. Stop breathing so loud. You're waking up the choir." Asterisk, the old, raspy voice coming from the battery, lest radio didn't flicker or crackle. It resonated directly from the speaker grill, crisp and dry, as if the person speaking were standing right between Marcus and me in the freezing concrete shaft. "You're standing on the roof of the vault, boys. Stop breathing so loud. You're waking up the choir." Marcus stared down at the dead radio on his shoulder, his fingers trembling as he slowly reached out to unclip it. But before his gloved hand could touch the plastic casing, the radio's green LED flashed blindingly white. An internal speaker melted into a sticky blob of black resin. The voice was gone, but the ground beneath our boots wasn't silent anymore. Below the concrete slab floor of the utility shaft, a deep, rhythmic thrumming began to pulse. It wasn't the 18.7 hertz infrasound tone we had been tracking all night. This was lower, a subterranean groan at roughly 4 or 5 hertz, a frequency so deep that our ears couldn't process its sound. We felt it in the enamel of our teeth. We felt it in the fluid behind our kneecaps. The floor? Marcus gasped, leaning his good shoulder heavily against the frosty concrete wall. "It's hollow." I dropped to my knees and the glittering ice crystals covering the floor. Sweeping my flashlight beam low across the ground, I saw it. A heavy, square steel hatch embedded directly into the concrete floor, almost completely obscured under a thick layer of hardened gray acoustic dust. Welded to the center of the hatch was a faded brass identification plate. U.S. Army Signal Corps, Project Acoustic Vault, EST 1953, Deep Storage Site 0. Warning, high acoustic density, dual lock reinforced. 1953, I whispered, scraping the frost off the brass plate with my fingernails. The FCC didn't build Stellar 6. They built a cover facility over an old Cold War site. "Julian, look at the latches," Marcus said, kneeling beside me. The hatch didn't use a standard mechanical lock or a keycard reader. It was sealed with 2 massive, counter-rotating cast iron wheels, heavily greased and completely untouched by the gray crystallization that had locked up the rest of the facility. The air directly above the hatch was strangely clear, as if the heavy steel plate were radiating a localized field that repelled the floating acoustic dust. It's isolated, I realized, touching the cold rim of the top wheel, neoprene dampeners and lead lining. Whatever is down there, the military built this hatch to keep the sound in, or to keep the valley from hearing what they put inside. Boom, above us, the solid plug of crystallized air encasing Elena groaned. Hairline fractures of pale blue light flared inside the gray glass around her body. The valley's pressure was building higher. The solid air behind us in the tunnel was expanding toward us inch by inch, slowly reducing our 10-foot pocket of survival. "We have no choice," Marcus grunted, grabbing the left spoke of the iron wheel. "Help me turn it." I gripped the right spoke. Together, we leaned our full body weight into the wheel. Creak. The ancient gears groaned in protest, metal grinding against metal, spitting flakes of red rust onto our sleeves. We threw our weight into a second turn, then a third. A loud, pneumatic hiss echoed through the shaft as the vacuum seal broke. Heavy, warm air burst upward to the seam of the hatch, air that smelled intensely of old paper, dry vacuum tubes, and stale ozone. Together, we hauled the heavy iron hatch upward and flipped it back onto the concrete floor with a dull thud. Below us lay a steep, narrow spiral staircase made of perforated iron, descending into a pitch-black abyss. Unlike the utility tunnel, there was no drifting gray acoustic dust down here. The air felt light, almost unnaturally thin and completely dry. "I'm going first," Marcus said, clicking his tactical light into his belt loop and drawing his sidearm. He slung his injured left arm into the front pocket of his parka and began his descent down the spiral stairs. I grabbed my recorder, secured the hard drive array inside my jacket, and followed him down into the dark. We descended nearly 40 feet beneath the valley floor before the iron stairs ended on a floor of smooth, dark slate. I swept my flashlight beam across the expanse, and my breath caught in my throat. The stellar, 6th vault was vast, a cavernous, circular bunker carved directly out of the mountain's solid ironstone bedrock. But it wasn't filled with computer servers or radio transmitters. The walls were lined from floor to ceiling with thousands of giant glass-enclosed vacuum tubes, each the size of a fire hydrant, glowing with a soft, amber filament wire. Wires thick as a man's wrist snaked across the floor, connecting the tubes to a massive central dais in the middle of the room. Sitting on top of the dais was an enormous, copper-plated acoustic horn. A 16-foot-wide gramophone-style bell pointed directly up at the bedrock ceiling. And sitting in a heavy wooden armchair right beside the copper horn was a human skeleton. The skeleton was dressed in a faded, olive-drab U.S. Army Signal Corps officer's uniform from the 1950s. The fabric was dry and covered in a fine layer of gray dust. Its bony hands were still resting on the armrest of the chair, its skull tilted upward, staring blankly into the mouth of the massive copper bell above it. Resting on the skeleton's lap was an open metal-bound ledger. I slowly stepped onto the dais, my boots making faint, echoing clicks on the slate floor. I reached down and picked up the ledger, dusting off the cover. Written on the first page in faded black fountain pen ink was a name, Major Thomas Vance, U.S. Army Signal Corps, Director of Operation Echo Vault, August 14, 1953. I stared at the ink, my heart freezing in my chest. "Vance, Julian," Marcus whispered, stepping up onto the dais behind me, his flashlight beam illuminating the skeleton's chest tag. Look at his name tag. Pinned to the tarnished wool jacket of the skeleton was an iron nameplate, M.J. T. Vance. My grandfather. I breathed, my hand shaking so violently the ledger nearly slipped from my fingers. My family told us he died in a training accident in Korea in 1954. They never found his body. The voice emerging from the copper horn didn't sound like a ghost, and it didn't sound like a speaker recording. It possessed my own grandfather's vocal timbre, but infused with my own speech patterns, my own cadence, and the exact slight rasp I get in my throat when I'm terrified. Asterisk, hello, Julian. I've missed our family's voice. Asterisk, The amber light from the thousands of vacuum tubes flared brighter, the glass bulbs singing with a high-pitched, harmonic whine that vibrated through the enamel of my teeth. Marcus reacted instantly. He dropped to his knees, pressed his back against the base of the copper horn, and clamped both hands over his ears. He remembered Major Vance's written warning, "Do not speak." I stood frozen on the dais, my eyes locked on the skeletal remains of my grandfather sitting inches away. The parchment-dry uniform seemed to rustle in the warm, ozone-scented draft billowing out of the copper bell. Then, Marcus made a fatal mistake. In his desperate attempt to remain silent, he let out a sharp, involuntary gasp of pain as his fractured shoulder slammed against the sharp edge of the brass dais. It wasn't a word. It wasn't even a vocalization. It was just a sharp, wheezing intake of air through clenched teeth, a human pain response. The copper horn responded instantly. The 16-foot wide bell didn't move, but the air inside its throat sucked inward with the force of industrial vacuum. The ambient light in the room didn't dim, but the acoustic space around Marcus vanished. Marcus opened his mouth to cry out, his eyes wide with sudden, agonizing shock. I watched in terror as his neck muscles strained, his chest heaving, his vocal cords visibly vibrating behind his windpipe. But no sound came out of him. The air around his face wasn't pushing sound outward. It was pulling the sound out his throat. A stream of pale, iridescent blue vapor, glowing piezo-luminescent sound energy, was pulled straight out of Marcus's open mouth. It streamed to the air in a tight, twisting spiral and vanished into the dark, yawning throat of the copper horn. Marcus clutched his throat with his good hand, his eyes rolling back. He wasn't suffocating from a lack of oxygen. The entity in the vault was literally stripping the acoustic resonance out of his vocal tissue. The physical ability to produce tone, to vibrate air, to create pitch was being ripped out of his body down to the cellular level. When the stream of blue vapor finally broke, Marcus collapsed sideways onto the slate floor. He was breathing, shallow, frantic gasps, but as his boots kicked against the stone, the impact made no noise. His heavy tactical belt hit the floor in total, dead silence. When he beat his fist against the brass dais in sheer panic, it sounded like a hand striking a block of solid velvet. Marcus had been rendered acoustically hollow. His voice was gone, not stolen for a moment, but excised from his biology forever. From the depth of the copper horn, the stolen tone was digested. A horrific, wet gurgle echoed from the vacuum tube arrays lining the circular walls. The thousands of glass bulbs flickered in rhythm, and then a new sound emerged from the copper bell. It spoke using Marcus's voice, crisp, authoritative, but completely devoid of soul. Asterisk, target secured. Sound density at critical mass. Preparing for atmospheric inversion. Asterisk. It was Marcus's voice, repeating military tactical jargon he had spoken during a contractor operation years ago, pulled right out of his subconscious memory banks and broadcast back into the vault. Marcus. I choked out, breaking the golden rule. I couldn't stop myself. The moment my voice crossed my lips, the copper horn turned its invisible acoustic gravity onto me. The air in my lungs immediately locked up. I felt a tremendous, crushing pull behind my sternum, as if an anchor had been dropped into my windpipe and pulled downward by a winch. My jaw was forced wide open. The muscles in my face went rigid, completely beyond my control. I felt my voice, every word I had ever spoken, every song my mother had sung to me, every secret I had whispered in the dark, rising up from my diaphragm like a wave of cold mercury. I looked at the skeleton of my grandfather sitting beside me. Major Thomas Vance's skull was staring up at the horn, its jaw wired open by decades of acoustic tension. And in that terrifying second, I realized why he was down here. He hadn't died of starvation or exposure. He had sat in this chair and let the vault drink every sound he possessed until there was nothing left of his humanity but dry bones and a uniform. No, my mind screamed, not like this. With the last shred of physical control I possessed, I didn't try to pull backward. I didn't try to close my mouth. Instead, I reached down to my belt, grabbed the multi-channel recorder, and slammed the heavy metal casing directly into the delicate glass face of the nearest vacuum tube on the dais. Crash! The giant glass tube exploded in a blinding shower of blue sparks and white-hot filament wire. The vacuum seal of the system broke. A deafening, catastrophic feedback loop erupted to the thousands of remaining tubes. The crushing pull on my chest snapped like a frayed cable. I was hurled backward off the dais, crashing hard onto the slate floor beside Marcus, the air exploding from my lungs in a ragged, gasping cough. The copper horn let out a high-pitched, metallic shriek, a sound like a train braking on rusty tracks. And then the vacuum tubes began to pop one by one like firecrackers down the line. Asterisk pop, 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 asterisk. Darkness flooded the vault as the amber filaments died. But the breaking of the system didn't kill the entity. It released it, the stolen sound that had been trapped inside the vacuum tubes for 70 years. Millions of decibels of compressed, ancient voices didn't stay in the copper horn. It began to leak out of the shattered glass tubes. It didn't come out as sound waves. It came out as a thick, swirling, suffocating cloud of gray, glowing acoustic fog that began to fill the circular room from floor up. And as the fog touched Marcus's boots, the gray dust began to climb his legs, wrapping around his knees like living vines. Marcus looked at me, his eyes wide with silent, desperate terror, his hands clawing at the stone floor as he tried to drag his muted body away from the rising tide of stolen voices. The gray acoustic fog didn't rise like smoke. It rose like a tide of heavy liquid, creeping across the slate floor of the vault in thick, rolling waves. Where the fog touched the stone, the floor didn't just get wet, it vibrated. Millions of microscopic, trapped acoustic signatures were grinding against the rock, creating a low, shivering rasp that felt like 1,000 tiny needles scratching against the bottom of my boots. Marcus couldn't scream. The entity had already stripped his vocal cords down to silence. He scrambled backward on his elbows, his good arm hauling his muted body across the floor, but the gray tide was too fast. The fog surged over his combat boots, climbing past his shins, wrapping around his knees like swirling tendrils of cold grease. The moment the fog made contact with his skin, Marcus's body stiffened. Through the translucent gray mist, I could see what the fog was doing to him. It wasn't burning his flesh. It was transcribing itself into him. Thousands of tiny, glowing blue lines, like geometric tattoos of pure piezoluminescent light, were spreading across his trousers, creeping up his thighs, mapping the standing wave patterns of the vault directly onto his nerve pathways. Marcus. I scrambled across the dais, grabbing the collar of his heavy parka with both hands. I hauled him backward with everything I had, my boots slipping on the slick slate floor. The fog clung to his legs, stretching into long, elastic threads of gray acoustic dust before snapping apart with faint, metallic pops, like microscopic guitar strings breaking in the dark. I dragged him up onto the raised stone platform of the central dais, right beside the copper horn and my grandfather's dry skeleton. Up here, 3 feet above the main floor, the air was still relatively clear, but the gray tide below was rising rapidly, filling the circular room at a rate of an inch every 5 seconds. Marcus collapsed against my chest, his face pale, his skin cold as ice. He reached up with his good hand, pointing frantically at his own mouth, then pointing down at the rising fog. He didn't have a voice anymore, but his eyes were screaming. I looked down into the swirling gray pool beneath the dais. The fog was no longer silent. As the stolen sound from 70 years of shattered vacuum tubes pooled in the dark, the air itself began to shape words. It wasn't a single voice. It was a chorus of the lost, thousands of distinct, overlapping human voices echoing out of fog without a single throat to produce them. We're so cold down here, Thomas. Check the frequency on channel 3. Tell my wife I left the key on the porch. It's in the rock. It's breathing through the rock. The voices weren't coming from speakers. They were vibrating out of the fog particles themselves. The physical air became a choir of dead thoughts, every syllable locked in an eternal, localized loop, bumping against each other, fusing into a dense, suffocating cloud of acoustic noise. The air. I gasped, touching my own neck. Even up on the dais, breathing was becoming nearly impossible. Every time I drew a breath, the ambient acoustic pressure forced tiny particles of the gray dust into my nostrils. It tasted like bitter copper and dry ash. My lungs felt heavy, as if I had spent hours breathing inside a flour mill. If we stayed on the dais for another 2 minutes, The fog would submerge the platform completely. We would be encased in solid, crystallized sound just like Elena at the top of the shaft. I looked up at the ceiling. Directly above the copper horn, 40 feet up in the shadows, was a circular opening of the iron spiral staircase we had descended. The heavy hatch at the top was locked, but the iron frame of the stairs ran straight down to the edge of the dais. I grabbed Marcus by his tactical harness and pulled him to his feet. I pointed up at the iron stairs, then pointed at his boots. He nodded once, his jaw set in desperate determination. He couldn't speak, but he understood, climb or turn to stone. I slung the heavy hard drive array over my chest, grabbed the iron handrail of the spiral staircase with my left hand, and used my right arm to support Marcus under his good shoulder. Together, we began to climb. Every step was a nightmare. Marcus's legs were still partially numb from the fog's acoustic tetany. His boots fell heavy, dragging against the iron rungs, making no sound as they struck the metal. Below us, the gray sea of stolen words swallowed the base of the staircase, rising higher, lapping at the lower steps like liquid lead. Halfway up the stairs, 20 feet above the vault floor, the air suddenly vibrated with deafening, catastrophic resonance. Boom! The 16-foot copper horn on the dais below us didn't shatter, it imploded. The massive copper bell crumpled inward like an aluminum can crushed under an iron boot. The sheer volume of compressed acoustic energy trapped inside the vault structure had reached critical mass. A geyser of pure, blinding white light erupted from the crushed horn, shooting straight up the center of the spiral staircase like a pillar of solid lightning. The shock wave hit us from below. The iron staircase buckled. The rusted bolt securing the frame to the ironstone wall sheared off with a series of loud, metallic snaps. Marcus and I were thrown upward, pinned against the curving iron handrail as the entire 40-foot staircase tilted sideways, swinging out over the abyss like a broken pendulum. I screamed, a raw, instinctual cry of terror, and as my voice echoed out into the dark, the white pillar of light beneath us absorbed my scream. The light turned a deep, bruised purple. The air inside the vertical shaft instantly thickened. The rising gray fog didn't just climb anymore. It shot upward to the center of the spiraling stairs, wrapping around our waists, locking our legs into place against the twisting iron frame. Hanging upside down 20 feet above the vault floor, pinned to a falling steel staircase by a wall of solidifying air, I looked up through the dark toward the sealed upper hatch, and through the heavy iron plate above us, coming from the utility tunnel, where we had left Elena trapped in her glass cage, came the sound of a heavy, rhythmic pounding. Thump, thump, thump. Something up that was trying to break down into the vault. And as the iron hatch bowed inward under the tremendous pressure, a voice we thought we had lost forever bled to the thick steel. A voice that was no longer human, speaking in a terrifying, multi-layered chorus. The voice bleeding through the heavy iron hatch above us wasn't just Elena's. It was her voice fused with a dozen others, a chorus of overlapping, distorted tones that sounded like an entire stadium of people speaking through a single, wet throat. Julian, Marcus, open the door. We've gathered all your future voices. We were hanging upside down over a 40-foot drop. The iron staircase groaned beneath our weight, its steel support cables snapping one by one like overtensioned piano wires. Below us, the vault floor was completely submerged under 5 feet of glowing, purple-gray acoustic fog. Above us, the iron hatch was bowing inward, the heavy rivets shearing off under the immense pressure from the utility tunnel. Marcus, unable to make a sound, looked up at me through the dim, bruised light. His face was slick with sweat, his eyes wide with a terrifying clarity. He didn't panic. He reached down with his good hand, grabbed a heavy iron pry bar clipped to his tactical pack, and jammed the wedge tip directly into the seam of the warping hatch above us. He couldn't speak, but his action was clear. If it's going to break, we break it on our terms. I braced my boots against the twisting railing of the staircase, reached up, and put both hands over Marcus's hands on the pry bar. Together, using the last reserve of our physical strength, we threw our combined weight against the iron lever. Crack-clang! The deadbolt mechanism on the hatch exploded into fragments. The heavy iron door swung upward, and the atmosphere inside the utility tunnel above us violently depressurized into the vault. A hurricane of frozen, gray acoustic dust blasted down to the opening, hitting us with the force of flash flood. The sudden equalizing of pressure snapped the remaining support cables of the spiral staircase. The entire 40-foot iron structure detached from the wall and plummeted into the dark void below. In that split second of freefall, Marcus and I lunged upward through the open hatchway, our fingers clawing frantically at the icy concrete rim of the tunnel floor. Behind us, the iron staircase crashed into the bottom of the vault with deafening, thunderous roar, a sound so massive it should have shattered our eardrums. But as the iron struck the slate floor, the 5-foot deep sea of gray acoustic fog absorbed the impact. The sound didn't echo. It was instantly swallowed, transformed into a violent, blinding pulse of purple light that illuminated the entire subterranean chamber for a fraction of a second before dying into pitch blackness. We hauled ourselves up onto the cold concrete floor of the utility tunnel, gasping for air, our lungs burning with a frost-cold, ozone-heavy atmosphere. We were back in the narrow hallway beneath the bunker, but the tunnel wasn't empty anymore. Standing 20 feet ahead of us in the narrow passage, blocking the path toward the surface exit, was a figure. It was Elena, or at least, it was what was left of her. She was no longer trapped inside the solid block of gray glass at the top of the ladder shaft. The acoustic crystallization encasing her body had fractured, but the material hadn't fallen away. It had integrated with her flesh. Her skin was smooth, pale gray, and completely translucent, like polished quartzite. Through her crystallized cheeks, I could see her teeth and her jawbone, illuminated by a faint, pulsing web of piezo-luminescent blue veins running through her neck. Her eyes were solid, milky spheres of frozen air, devoid of pupils, and her jaw was still locked wide open in that awful, rigid square shape. Marcus scrambled back against the concrete wall, drawing his Glock with his right hand, his hands trembling violently as he aimed the weapon at his former colleague. "Marcus, don't." I rasped, my throat raw, blood trickling from my nose from the sudden pressure change. "If you shoot, the kinetic energy will shatter the whole tunnel." Elena's translucent body didn't step forward. She didn't walk. She vibrated 3 feet closer to us, her body gliding over frosty floorboards without her feet moving, like a needle skipping across a spinning vinyl record. And then, from deep inside her crystalline chest, from her frozen, petrified lungs, a sound began to build. It wasn't a whisper. It wasn't a chorus of dead technicians. It was a recording of the future. The air in the tunnel turned ice cold as her throat emitted a 3-channel, pristine audio playback of this exact moment, recorded 3 minutes from now, through the crystalline speaker of her open mouth. We heard our own voices screaming in the dark. "My eyes! God, Julian, it's taking my eyes." That was Marcus's voice, speaking with frantic, desperate terror that he was currently physically incapable of producing. And right behind his voice came my own voice, ragged, dying, pleading with something in the dark. "Don't let the wave hit the town. Smash the drives. Marcus, smash the hard drives before the signal reaches the ridge." I stared at Elena's frozen face, my mind reeling in absolute, paralyzing horror. The valley hadn't just predicted our deaths. It had already cataloged the exact sequence of events that would destroy us. The sound wave of our final, agonizing moments was already traveling backward to the geological strata, waiting for us to catch up to the timeline it had already written. Elena took another gliding step toward us. The air around her body began to freeze into geometric, floating rings of gray dust. "It's time to complete the loop, Julian." The multi-layered chorus of her voice resonated from the concrete walls. "Your future scream is the loudest one in the valley. Give it to us." Marcus looked at me. Then he looked down at the heavy, steel-cased solid-state hard drive array strapped to my chest, the drive containing the entire digital telemetry record of Stellar 6. He didn't have a voice, but he raised his Glock, pointed the barrel directly at the drive array strapped to my ribs, and pulled his finger tight against the trigger. Marcus didn't pull the trigger to kill me. He pulled the trigger to destroy the future. Bang! The 9mm hollow point bullet struck the center of the heavy steel-cased hard drive array strapped to my chest. The kinetic impact hit me like a sledgehammer, knocking the breath from my lungs and hurling me backward onto the icy concrete floor. The metal casing of the drive exploded in a shower of sparks, sheared silicon chips, and torn circuit boards. in a normal world. Destroying a hard drive simply erases digital data. But inside Valley Zero, digital data wasn't just magnetic ones and zeros. The stellar 6 array had spent 72 hours recording the high-density acoustic telemetry of this valley. It held billions of compressed sound waves trapped in its flash memory cells. When the bullet shattered the silicon substrate, those compressed waves didn't disappear. They released all at once. Crack boom! A catastrophic acoustic feedback loop erupted from the shattered drive on my chest. A localized shockwave of pure, blinding blue light blasted outward in a 360-degree ring. The sound was unbearable. It wasn't loud, it was dense. It felt like 2 tectonic plates grinding together inside my eardrums. The force of the release hit Elena's crystalline body head-on. The translucent gray glass of her face spiderwebbed with millions of hairline fractures. Her wide-open square jaw shattered into a cloud of glowing blue dust. The multi-layered chorus of voices coming from her chest let out a distorted, high-pitched shriek, like a reel-to-reel tape being yanked backward at 1,000 revolutions per minute, before her entire upper torso disintegrated into a fine powder of gray acoustic ash that collapsed onto the floor. Julian, a voice barked through the settling dust. I froze on the floor, my chest burning where the bullet had flattened against the steel backing plate of my harness. The voice hadn't come from the walls. It hadn't come from an echo. It had come from Marcus. The big engineer was lying 5 feet away, clutching his throat, his mouth open as he gasped for air. The violent acoustic blast from the destroyed drive had disrupted the entity's lock on his biology. The sheer kinetic shock had forcibly injected resonance back into his vocal cords. Marcus. I coughed, spitting a mouthful of metallic-tasting blood onto frost. Your voice. It hurts like swallowing glass, Marcus rasped, his voice raw, bleeding, barely recognizable, but undeniably his. Get up. The tunnel is collapsing. The destruction of the drive array hadn't just shattered Elena. It had destabilized the entire acoustic balance of Valley Zero. By forcibly releasing terabytes of raw, compressed sound data into the hypersaturated air, we had triggered a chain reaction. The geological strait of the mountain were rejecting the energy spike. The concrete walls of the utility tunnel began to vibrate at a terrifying frequency. Hairline cracks zipped along the ceiling like striking lightning bolts. Long, needle-like icicles of crystallized gray air snapped from the concrete, raining down onto the floor like falling glass daggers. Out toward the upper drainage shaft. I screamed, scrambling to my feet and dragging Marcus up by his parka. We didn't look back at the pile of gray ash that used to be Dr. Elena Rostova. We ran. We bolted down the final 100 yards of the utility passageway, our boots pounding against the fracturing concrete. Behind us, the tunnel was literally erasing itself, the walls collapsing inward as the air solidified into solid, seamless blocks of gray rock, chasing us down the corridor like a crushing piston. Ahead, the darkness yielded to a faint, pale beam of moonlight. The upper drainage exit, a massive, 6-foot-wide corrugated steel pipe, was standing open where the mountain slope broke into the open air. We didn't slow down. We threw ourselves forward, diving headfirst to the mouth of the steel pipe and tumbling out into the freezing night air of Valley Zero. We slammed onto the steep, rock-strewn slope outside, rolling 50 feet down a frozen embankment through dead pine needles and jagged ironstone scree before crashing into a thick snowbank at the base of a massive rock face. For a long, agonizing minute, we lay in the snow, gasping for air, our lungs burning with a sharp, clean bite of real mountain oxygen. Above us, the stellar 6 bunker shuddered. The 200-foot lattice radio tower rising from a roof began to twist. Under the immense invisible pressure of the subterranean sound wave building beneath it, the heavy steel beams sheared off at the base. With a sickening silent groan, the massive tower toppled sideways, crashing down into forest, crushing hundreds of ancient hemlocks beneath its weight. Did we stop it? Marcus wheezed, sitting up in the snow, wiping blood from his chin, his eyes darting wildly toward a collapsed bunker. No, I whispered, staring up at the razor-sharp crest of Black Ridge above us. I reached for my isolation headphones, which were still somehow hanging around my neck by a single frayed wire. I put them on my ears. The forest around us was no longer silent. The -12 dB anomaly was gone. The valley wasn't quiet anymore. It was singing. From every cliff face, every ironstone ridge, every underground cavern, and every needle on the pine trees, a single, unified frequency was building. A massive, terrifying wave of pure infrasound was rising out of the earth, concentrating itself into a single focal point right at the narrow mouth of the valley exit. The entire valley had become a charged weapon, and it wasn't holding the sound inside anymore. It was preparing to fire it outward, straight toward the small mountain towns lying 10 miles down the highway. And as I sat in the bloody snow, my headphones began to pick up the audio signature of that gathering wave. It wasn't a random hum. It was the voice of the entire valley, speaking with a volume that shook the stars in the night sky above. Thank you for opening the vault, Julian. Now we can finally be heard everywhere. The voice echoing from a mountain ridge didn't decay into the sky. It lingered, riding the subaudible 18.7 hertz pulse that was now violently shaking the snowbank beneath our bodies. The air surrounding us was no longer crisp or cold. It felt dense, oily, and saturated with sharp, static charge that made every hair on my arm stand straight up. As I pulled myself up against the jagged ironstone rock face, I realized the snow beneath our boots was turning gray. The falling flakes weren't ice. They were fine, crystalline flakes of frozen sound, fluttering down from the night sky like radioactive fallout. Thank you for opening the vault, Julian. Now we can finally be heard everywhere. Marcus dragged himself out of the snowbank, his breath coming in ragged, wheezing hitches. Every time his lungs expanded, his chest produced a sickening, wet rattle. The brief restoration of his vocal cords was fading fast. The tissue in his throat was swelling shut from the acoustic trauma. Julian, he croaked, spraying a fine mist of blood onto the gray snow. The highway, we have to reach the suburban. We can't run from it, Marcus, I said, pointing my trembling flashlight back up toward the crest of Black Ridge. The entire mountain slope was visibly undulating. The ancient white pines and hemlocks weren't swaying the wind. There was no wind. The trees were vibrating in geometric patterns, their trunks shivering in sync with the subterranean wave building beneath the valley floor. The focused acoustic lens of Valley Zero was no longer just reflecting sound. It was amplifying it exponentially, the destruction of the stellar. Sixth Vault had broken the containment field, and the millions of captured voices in the last 3 centuries were rushing up from the deep geological strata like gas escaping a ruptured wellhead. Then I felt it, a cold, sharp itch deep inside my chest. I tried to draw a breath, but my diaphragm locked halfway through the expansion. I didn't cough. I couldn't. When I opened my mouth to inhale, I didn't pull in oxygen. The gray, airborne acoustic dust hanging in the air was drawn straight down my trachea, like iron filings pulled to a magnet. It wasn't settling in my nasal passages or throat. It was bypassing my biological defenses, entering the alveoli of my lungs, and attaching itself directly to my bronchial tissue. Marcus, I gasped, my knees buckling as my vision swam with pinpricks of violent blue light. Don't breathe deep. It's in the air. Marcus looked at me in horror, grabbing his own throat. He tried to hold his breath, his eyes bulging, the veins in his neck standing out like thick blue cables. But the human body can only resist the urge to breathe for so long. After 40 seconds, his chest spasmed involuntarily. His mouth snapped open, and he drew a massive, desperate gulp of the gray, static-charged atmosphere. The moment the air crossed his lips, a sickening, crystalline crack echoed from inside his torso. Marcus fell to his knees in the gray snow. He didn't scream. He couldn't. The acoustic dust entering his lungs immediately reacted with the moisture and acoustic resonance of his own heartbeat. Through his heavy winter parka, I could see his chest cavity expanding, not with air, but with solidifying structural resonance. His rib cage was bowing outward, the intercostal muscles locking rigid as the air inside his lungs began to turn into a solid, translucent lattice of gray acoustic glass. He looked up at me, his face turning a deep hypoxic purple, his hands clawing uselessly at his sternum. And then, from inside his chest, from beneath his calcifying ribs, his lungs began to speak. It wasn't his voice anymore. It was a clear, pristine, high-frequency broadcast of the emergency distress frequency used by regional emergency services. Mayday, mayday, mayday. All stations on frequency. This is FCC Field Team 1. We have lost containment at Valley 0. Atmospheric crystallization is spreading down the drainage corridor toward Route 33. Do not attempt rescue. Repeat, do not. The message cut off abruptly with a wet, heavy thud. The air inside Marcus's chest completely solidified. His lungs had turned to solid glass. His ribcage locked in an eternal, wide-open state of expansion, preserving the shape of his final, fatal breath. Marcus's eyes went glossy and vacant, staring blankly up at the bruised, purple sky. He didn't fall over. He remained kneeling in the gray snow, a human statue carved out of bone, frozen tissue, and crystallized sound. I backed away from his body, my hands trembling so violently I dropped my flashlight into the gray snow. My own lungs were burning. I could feel the microscopic lattice of gray dust spreading to my bronchial tree, a cold, sharp sensation like thousands of tiny glass needles embedding themselves into my respiratory lining. Every time my heart beat, my chest emitted a faint, high-pitched ringing sound, the sound of my own biological resonance beginning to lock up. I picked up the shotgun microphone from the snow and held it to my own mouth. Through my isolation headphones, I heard my own chest. Deep inside my lungs, the gray dust was organizing itself. It was constructing an acoustic footprint, a precise, physical recording of my entire life's voice, getting ready to turn my chest into the final speaker for the valley's catastrophic release. I looked down the winding mountain trail toward the valley exit. A mile ahead, where the access road crossed a dry creek bed to join the main highway, the air was no longer transparent. A towering 200-foot wall of solidifying gray acoustic fog was moving down the corridor like a slow-motion tsunami, turning trees, rocks, and soil into solid, glass-like structures as it advanced toward the populated towns beyond Black Ridge. I had maybe 10 minutes before my lungs completely crystallized, 10 minutes before my voice became part of the choir forever. I clutched the remaining cables of my recorder, turned toward the epicenter of the rising wave at the crest of Black Ridge, and began my final, solo descent into the heart of the anomaly. The climb up toward the crest of Black Ridge felt less like scaling a mountain and more like wading into the core of an active turbine. Every step I took was a battle against localized pockets of sonic gravity. The air around my knees was so dense that pulling my feet out of the gray snow required a deliberate, agonizing effort. My chest felt like an iron cage lined with broken glass. Every shallow, ragged breath I managed to drag into my lungs clicked with faint, metallic resonance against my ribs. Behind me, Marcus sat frozen in the gray drift, a silent monument to the valley's hunger. Ahead of me, the world was dissolving into pure geometry. As I reached the highest ledge overlooking the mouth of Valley 0, the landscape spread out beneath the bruised, starlit sky looked entirely alien. The trees weren't hemlocks anymore. They had been encased in translucent layers of gray, mineralized air, their branches frozen into delicate, sweeping fractals of solidified sound. The entire valley basin was glowing with a deep, pulsing indigo light, a massive piezo-luminescent engine fueled by 3 centuries of trapped human terror. At the exact geographic center of the basin, right where the ironstone cliffs converged into a narrow, parabolic bowl, sat the acoustic event horizon. It wasn't a hole in the ground. It was a sphere of absolute, light-bending acoustic density, 20 feet in diameter, hovering 10 feet off the valley floor. The sphere wasn't dark. It was a swirling, liquid mirror of compressed air molecules, reflecting the surrounding mountains in distorted, undulating waves. Inside that sphere, millions of decibels of sound were trapped in an infinite orbital loop. It didn't produce noise. It absorbed it. Every footstep I took, every crackle of frost beneath my boots, every frantic beat of my failing heart was instantly pulled toward the sphere, stretched out and swallowed whole. I pulled off my isolation headphones and let them hang over my chest. Through my own ears, the world was completely dead. But through the microphone rig strapped to my arm, the telemetry was terrifying. The 18.7 hertz infrasound pulse had stopped fluctuating. It had hit a flat, continuous spike at 140 decibels, a sound level loud enough to violently vibrate human internal organs to pieces, yet held at a frequency so low that the human ear experienced it only as a sudden, overwhelming sense of cosmic dread. My lungs were hardening fast. I could feel the microscopic glass lattice spreading up my windpipe, locking the muscles of my throat. In less than 3 minutes, my vocal tract would freeze completely, turning my chest into another broadcast horn for the wave. I opened my Pelican case with numb, stiff fingers and pulled out the final piece of gear I had left, a heavy, battery-powered acoustic calibration generator, a specialized tool used by FCC field engineers to send high output, inverted phase cancellation tones down damaged fiber lines. Phase cancellation is simple physics. If a sound wave hits a microphone at a specific frequency, and you play back the exact same wave flipped upside down, a 180-degree antiphase wave, the two waves collide, cancel each other out, and collapse into absolute zero. It was a suicide play. To invert the valley's frequency, I couldn't just broadcast a generic tone. I had to feed the generator a live, pristine audio sample of the valley's core frequency, and to do that, I had to place the shotgun microphone directly into the center of the event horizon. I dragged my breaking body across the final 10 yards of frozen scree, stepping out onto the narrow stone ledge right in front of the hovering indigo sphere. The heat radiating off the sphere was negative, an intense, biting cold that froze the moisture on my eyelids in seconds. The air pressure pushed against my face like a solid hand, forcing my head back, trying to drive the breath out of my body. I raised the aluminum boom pole, extending the shotgun microphone forward, inch by inch, toward the swirling, mirrored surface of the acoustic sphere. The moment the tip of the microphone crossed the threshold of the sphere, my studio headphones, hanging against my chest, shrieked. It wasn't a voice. It was every voice. Millions of sound waves collided inside my skull all at once. I heard my grandfather's final dying breath in 1953. I heard Miller Inchin screaming as her lungs turned to stone. I heard Elena's crystalline chest shattering. I heard Marcus's final broadcast. I heard my own mother singing to me in an empty hospital room. And beneath it all, I heard the ancient, pre-human groan of the mountain itself, a dark, conscious entity that had been waiting beneath the earth for millennia, using our voices as a bridge to cross over into the physical world. The gray glass inside, my throat surged upward. My jaw snapped wide open, locking into that awful, rigid square. My chest began to vibrate violently, my sternum cracking against my ribs as the valley prepared to pull my final, catastrophic scream out of my throat to shatter the surrounding towns. With the last fraction of human willpower left in my central nervous system, I slammed my thumb down onto the big red button on the calibration generator. Invert phase, 18.7 hertz, full output. The generator hummed. The digital display flashed bright crimson. A single, inverted antiphase wave of pure kinetic energy surged up the cable to the shotgun mic and exploded straight into the center of the acoustic event horizon. For a second, the universe held its breath. The indigo sphere stopped swirling. The liquid mirror surface cracked like real glass. And then, the sphere began to turn inside out. The inversion didn't create an explosion of fire or light. It created a void. When the antiphase wave slammed into the center of the acoustic event horizon, the two opposing forces didn't just clash. They canceled out the physical fabric of the air itself. The 20-foot indigo sphere collapsed inward with a sickening, wet pop, sucking the ambient pressure out of the valley in a fraction of a second. A massive vacuum wave imploded at the center of the basin, tearing the frozen, gray acoustic fog off the hemlocks and ripping the crystalline dust straight out of the atmosphere. The force of the implosion struck me full in the chest. The hard drive harness snapped, and I was launched backward off the stone ledge, tumbling through the darkness, crashing down through frozen branches and snow before slamming onto the cold floor of the drainage canal 50 feet below. Pain exploded through my side. Broken ribs, a dislocated shoulder, a concussive shock that turned my vision into a chaotic swirl of white static. I lay flat on my back in the gray slush, gasping for air. My mouth opened and my lungs expanded. I drew a deep, ragged breath. The air was cold. It tasted of damp pine, wet soil, and fresh snow. The sharp, glass-like needles inside my trachea were gone, shattered by the antiphase shockwave, dissolved back into harmless moisture. I coughed, spitting up mouthfuls of gray, gritty slush onto the snowbank, but my throat was open. My vocal cords belonged to me again. Above me, the sky was clear. The bruised, purple hue had faded, leaving only the sharp, brilliant diamond light of the winter stars staring down at the quiet earth. The 18.7 hertz pulse was gone. The mountain had stopped vibrating. I pulled myself up against the concrete wall of the drainage ditch, my entire body throbbing with agony. I looked back up toward the crest of Black Ridge. The indigo glow was completely extinguished. The towering wall of acoustic fog that had been advancing down Route 33 toward the mountain towns had collapsed into thin, drifting mist that harmlessly dissipated in the night breeze. I was alive. I had broken the loop. I limped through the snow for nearly 2 hours, dragging my broken body down the winding access trail toward the edge of the property line, where we had parked the Chevrolet Suburban 6 hours ago. The Suburban was standing right where we left at the edge of the dry creek bed, its dark paint dusted with a fresh layer of white snow. I stumbled to the driver's side door, my trembling hands pulling the keys from my pocket. I collapsed into the driver's seat, slammed the door shut, and turned the ignition. The V8 engine roared to life with a warm, reassuring rumble that sent heater air blasting into the cabin. I put my head against the steering wheel and wept. Raw, sobbing gasps of pure, unadulterated relief. Elena was gone. Marcus was gone. My grandfather's bones were buried under 40 feet of collapsed ironstone in the stellar 6 vault, but the valley was silent. The anomaly had been destroyed. I reached out with a trembling hand, flicked on the Suburban's dashboard radio, and dialed it to the regional FCC monitoring frequency to report the disaster and call for emergency extraction. The dashboard display lit up blue. 88.9 megahertz, local relay. I took a deep breath, grabbed the radio hand mic, and pressed the talk button. Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is Senior Specialist Julian Vance, FCC Field Team 1, requesting immediate emergency medical and tactical assistance at Black Ridge, Valley 0. Do you copy? I released the button. The radio speaker didn't produce static. It didn't produce an operator's voice. Instead, a clear, pristine 3-second audio playback came through the dashboard speakers. A voice I knew better than my own. Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is Senior Specialist Julian Vance, FCC Field Team 1. I froze, my blood turning to liquid ice in my veins. I stared at the dashboard radio. The green receiving LED was flickering in rhythm with the playback. I grabbed the volume knob and slammed it all the way to the left, turning the radio off. The digital screen went black. The voice didn't stop. Through the dashboard speakers, through the car's climate control vents, through the engine block, and vibrating directly out of the leather fabric of the seat beneath my thigh, the playback continued with absolute, terrifying clarity. Requesting immediate emergency medical and tactical assistance at Black Ridge, Valley 0. Do you copy? I looked out the driver's side window. The fresh white snow covering the hood of the Suburban wasn't white anymore. A fine, gray dust was falling from the clear night sky, settling over the windshield, organizing itself into perfectly symmetrical, concentric rings across the glass. And as I sat in the idling vehicle, unable to scream, unable to move, my isolation headphones, lying broken on the passenger seat beside me, emitted a soft, wet whisper. Phase cancellation doesn't destroy a sound wave, Julian. It just gives it an echo from nowhere. The engine stalled. The headlights flickered out. And in the absolute, total darkness of Valley 0, the air inside my chest began to hum once more.